No taxation without representation. Our democracy was founded on those 4 words, and yet nearly 250 years later, the same principle doesn't apply in the heart of democracy, Washington, our nation's capital.
We here in D.C. deserve the same rights as other citizens in this country, and we're sick and tired of being second-class citizens.
There's a trajectory toward change, an energetic movement to bring D.C.'s residents the same rights as every American. Today, for only the second time in history, the U.S. Senate debates D.C. statehood.
It can live up to our nation's founding principles and pass our D.C. statehood bill.
Join us as we acknowledge this pinnacle moment in our town's history, an initiative built on by previous generations, our current leaders hoping to deliver equality. We'll be talking with those in favor and those against. I'll be answering your questions along the way. It's your town, your vote, and your voice matters. Live from the U.S. Capitol, the Q&A starts right now. And good evening, I'm Adam Longo, live from Capitol Hill, where this momentum just continues to advance more and more each year. D.C. statehood for only the second time in history in front of senators here on Capitol Hill. It has passed the House of Representatives the last 2 years in a row. D.C. leaders optimistic, but at the same time realistic. There was a rally outside at 2nd and East Capitol earlier this morning where all of the proponents of D.C. statehood gathered again. This has become a norm for them to gather outside of the Capitol on the morning before one of these hearings to celebrate the chance of them becoming the 51st state. The hearing itself today in the Senate lasting about 2.5 hours. I'd like you to listen in real quick because I was able to talk with D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and D.C.'s elected delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton of their impressions coming out of that meeting today. Listen.
What we saw today is all the arguments have been exhausted. So we hear the same arguments. We have constitutional backup to say that this Congress, and in particular this Senate, has it within its power to right our 220-year wrong.
I spoke with the chairman before I left about the next steps, and he says the next step is he's going to meet with his caucus in order to see where they go. So he wasn't at liberty to say on his own. But I do think when you get this far, that you can't let it hang there.
So the question there to Delegate Norton, it kind of gets in the weeds here, but the markup procedure. So essentially for this to advance to the Senate floor for a vote, it would have to go back and be discussed again in this same committee. Republicans would likely propose amendments and then the committee would vote. Now, because of the 50-50 tie in the Senate, if there is a tie in the committee, there are 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee where this hearing was held today. If it's a tie, it would still advance to the floor for a full vote. We'll be talking about that moving forward and the potential for that vote coming up just a little bit later in the show. But right now I want to talk about the energy and the movement that was outside the Capitol today. Our Jess Arnold was able to speak with some of the advocates and folks out there rallying for change to advance D.C. as the 51st state.
Advocates have been pushing for D.C. statehood for years, from grassroots organizing to murals like this one around the city. They say it goes beyond even that long-standing rally cry of taxation without representation.
Statehood wins! Statehood now!
Many voices with a shared goal, D.C. statehood, each for their own reasons.
In the shadow of the Washington Monument, I became a second-class citizen, and that's when I started trying to do something about it.
From a straightforward desire to have representation in Congress.
As a native Washingtonian, I understand that this is bigger than just political talking points, that there are 700,000 plus lived realities attached to the fate of this legislation that's moving through the Senate. And so, like I said, it's beautiful to be heard, but just wanting to see being heard translated into something that shows us that we have been heard.
To autonomy over local laws.
Congress oversees a chunk of our budget. It's, the oversight is not fair. For example, when the first stimulus package came out of Congress to help Americans with the impact of COVID on people's health and on their local businesses, they cut the amount they gave DC. They said, let's call them a territory.
To racial justice.
And DC statehood, it is impossible to see those outcomes and not see it through a racial lens in the city that are predominantly occupied by Black and brown residents.
Groups like Sunrise Movement DC are working to drum up support for State 51 in the current 50.
It's definitely having those hard conversations about what not having statehood means for us as DC residents.
They're all determined to see this fight through.
If it doesn't happen tomorrow, we'll be here again and again and again because it's the right thing to do.
In Northwest DC, Jess Arnold, WUSA9.
Now, a lot of these advocacy groups, 51 for 51, for instance, have spent a lot of money trying to convince the 4 Democratic senators who have yet to sign on to the Senate bill for DC statehood, S51. They've put up billboards in their hometowns. They've helped to sponsor letter drives because there are still those 4 Democratic holdouts who have not said that they would not vote for this bill. They just have not signed on at this point as co-sponsors. Now, I want to take you inside of what was happening inside of that hearing today. You know, DC's elected leaders and congressional Democrats, they keep pushing the ball forward more and more each time. But the Republicans in the Senate on this committee today, it appeared that they had absolutely no appetite to entertain DC becoming the 51st state.
They have been fighting for this for 220 years. We will not quit until we achieve full democracy.
D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser has worn out a path from her office to Capitol Hill. But today, for the first time, she laid out the case for senators on why D.C. should become the 51st state. Chief among those reasons, residents being taxed without being represented.
The people of the District of Columbia have no interest in waging a war for independence. They just want to be treated fairly and justly.
Among Mayor Bowser's allies, Delaware Democrat Tom Carper, who's lead sponsor of the D.C. statehood bill. 45 other Democrats have signed on to the bill, and Carper has brought former Senator and Vice Presidential nominee Joe Lieberman back to the Capitol to try and sway uncommitted senators.
The arguments against this legislation don't come near to overcoming the great principled constitutional arguments for it.
From my standpoint, again, we can talk about the constitutionality, we can talk about the complexities with the statutes and how to deal with the 23rd Amendment. To me, this seems like just a naked power grab.
Republican senators in the hearing questioned if it's constitutional for D.C. to become a state and if all but a sliver of D.C. should just rejoin Maryland.
The Democrats think that they won't be able to control the United States Senate in the long term. They need to add 2 more Democrat seats to control the Senate, so it's really, really important.
D.C. residents, you know, Senator, aren't asking for special treatment. We are asking to be treated equally.
So it's 220 years of history that brings us to this moment today. It was the Organic Act of 1801 that put the district in firm control of Congress. And it was at that moment in February of 1801 that the folks who lived and resided in D.C. no longer had the right to vote in D.C., no longer had congressional representation. You know, one interesting fact that I heard today that I hadn't heard before in all of the arguments was about the 13 colonies and how many, what was the population of the 13 colonies when they ratified the Constitution, and combined it was less than the 700,000 residents that D.C. has today. Now we're going to check in with our Verify team. Our Evan Kozlov is talking about what D.C.'s name would become if D.C. were to become the 51st state.
Our Verify researchers have been plugged into this hearing all day. And here's one Verify fast fact for you all. If D.C. becomes the 51st state, it will no longer be called the District of Columbia. According to the bill itself, appropriately named S51, it would be called the State of Washington Douglas Commonwealth. As for the proposed federal land that would be excluded from the new state, which would include spots like the White House, the Capitol, and the Supreme Court, that territory would be called the Capitol with an A. Now, if you have a question that you want the Verify team to research, just shoot us an email at verify@WUSA9.com.
So look, there are a ton of arguments both for and against D.C. statehood. We've seen a lot of them in these hearings. For instance, here's one of them. Is making D.C. the 51st state even constitutional? We're going to be talking with lawmakers on both sides of that issue when our live show from Capitol Hill comes back. So for all of the arguments both for and against D.C. statehood, one of the key arguments is about the constitutionality. Now, we talked to Congressman Jamie Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, who had a vote on this. He was part of the House Oversight Committee, but he also is a constitutional law professor. So this guy knows his stuff. So we went some quick questions with Congressman Raskin about D.C. statehood and is it constitutional? Listen. Okay, so first question. Why didn't the founding fathers just set up D.C. as a state?
The basic principle was to have military and police security over the Capitol in order to avoid a situation like they saw in Philadelphia, where the Constitutional or the Continental Congress had called out to the governor of Pennsylvania for his help in getting the militia to come to put down a riot by disgruntled Revolutionary War soldiers who hadn't been paid. And so one of the things that Madison wrote about was that Congress should exercise control over the Capitol and that district area.
Next question. Would making D.C. the 51st state be unconstitutional?
The country began with 13 states. 37 states have been admitted since the Republic began. All of them have been admitted by simple acts of Congress, not by constitutional amendments. And I don't know if it's a majority of the states, but certainly a lot of the states have been accused of being unconstitutional, which is kind of a silly formulation anyway, because it's up to Congress to decide. The Supreme Court has said that the admission of new states is a political question, by which the court means it's up to Congress to decide, and it's not up to the Supreme Court to give thumbs up or thumbs down to particular states.
And finally, why can't most of D.C. just rejoin Maryland?
There's no constitutional impediment to that. That's just a political and historical question. You know, what do people want? And obviously the people in Washington, D.C. feel as if they have evolved in a different political direction and want to become their own state. They believe they have their own political identity and history.
All right, in just a moment, we'll be talking to one of the congressional Republicans who was on the Oversight Committee, and he'll be talking to us about his arguments, how he thinks it is not constitutional to be able to make D.C. the 51st state. We'll also be talking with D.C.'s shadow senator about the next steps moving forward. The Q&A will be right back. Pleased to be joined by House Oversight Committee member Republican Jody Hice of Georgia. You were part of the last several hearings where D.C. statehood was voted on. I know your opposition to it. First of all, thank you, because we don't get a lot of Republicans to come on D.C. local media to discuss this issue. I wanted to talk the last hearing. You specifically got a lot of criticism for bringing up dealerships, landfills. You know, these are things that might maybe disqualify D.C. from being a state. Is that the way you feel, that those things would just be disqualifying for D.C.?
No, not at all. I mean, I was just bringing up the obvious. It's amazing the type of things that become an issue, and I was just trying to give examples of, I mean, states have a lot of things that go along with the states as a whole. And when you talk about D.C., an individual city, obviously they can't compete with what states have and what states have. I'm not aware of a car dealership. That's why I brought it up. I haven't driven around looking everywhere, but the point was, look, I mean, states have landfills. They have things that D.C. would not have. But beside the point, it's a constitutional issue, and that is the heart of this. And it has been turned into a political issues, really, regarding 2 senators and 1 more House of Representatives.
So there have been a number of constitutional scholars who say, in fact, that it is constitutional. Congressman Raskin, who's on the committee, a constitutional law professor, says it is. So is that just where that argument's going to go, just back and forth?
Well, it's not going to go back and forth at the end of the day. The Supreme Court will have a decision. Look, there's been multiple decisions over the years against D.C. statehood, beginning with our founders. They deliberately, I mean, the 23rd Amendment is all about the district is uniquely different from every other state in the Union. It was not designed to be a state. It was designed to be a place where all states gather to do business without influence of a state.
We have just a few seconds left. Is there any mechanism that you support for the 700,000 residents of D.C. to have representation in Congress?
There have been some other options with, obviously Maryland being involved in this. If people want to have representation, that's an option, again, that needs to be explored. But to this point, it has not been legitimately explored. It's been, so far in our hearings, D.C. statehood or nothing.
Right. Congressman Jody Hice, we appreciate your time. Thanks for coming all the way over here for us. Appreciate it. All right, we're going to also talk now with D.C.'s shadow Senator Paul Strauss about the next steps forward in this process. Listen to this. Joining us to discuss more in depth this D.C. statehood issue is D.C.'s shadow senator, Paul Strauss, elected by the folks here in D.C. Paul, thanks for coming on with us. I have a question about how we advance the D.C. statehood measure from here. I mean, just tonight, Senate Republicans have blocked the Democrats' signature, one of their signature pieces of legislation, S1, the For the People Act. So if that is blocked, why wouldn't we expect D.C. statehood to get the same sort of treatment for Republicans?
Well, I think it is likely that Republicans are going to try and block the bill, but we have a powerful argument that the filibuster really shouldn't apply to statehood acts. You know, the framers, when they were writing the Constitution, set supermajority as the threshold for some issues and simple majority for others. And in Article 4, Section 3, the admission of new states, it was the founding fathers themselves that said states were admitted by simple majority vote. And so if you want to be true to the Constitution, you should pass D.C. statehood with a simple majority vote.
So we have a problem with that, and that is 4 Democrats have yet to co-sponsor and sign on to this bill. We already know that Joe Manchin is inclining to go against it. So how do you bring those additional senators on board if we're not going to make D.C. a state, excluding the filibuster?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of work. You know, Senator Manchin's arguments were not against D.C. statehood per se. He had questions about the constitutionality of the legislation. A lot of those questions were answered today by some very compelling testimony by some brilliant law professors who made it clear that passing D.C. statehood with simple legislation is entirely constitutional because we keep a neutral seat of government. We just shrink it to the size of the actual federal district now. And so hopefully, if he wasn't able to watch the proceedings directly, he can read the record. He could read some of this testimony. Same with some of the other Democrats who have yet to be on the bill. But a lot of people didn't think that we'd get Senator Manchin to be voting for S1. And so you can't always presume by early statements how people will ultimately vote in the end when the question comes up.
Sure. We're going to have to leave it right there. Paul Strauss, D.C.'s shadow senator, thank you. You've heard from lawmakers and D.C. leaders. Just give me 3 minutes, and I'm going to come back with my thoughts on this historic night for the district. Real matters. It's more than a hashtag. It's who we are. What matters here is for the last 220 years, anyone who's been a resident of D.C. has not had any voting representation in Congress. In fact, anyone who lived in D.C. up until 1964 didn't even get to vote for president. Now, while the main focus for getting D.C. representation is by achieving statehood, there's a parallel initiative happening called retrocession. You see, Maryland ceded the land that makes up D.C., so one idea is, except for the National Mall, the museums, the Capitol, the White House, give it all back to Maryland. Congressional Republicans have brought this up, and there's also a movement to transform D.C. into Douglas County, Maryland. Now, it doesn't have the support of any of D.C. or Maryland's leaders. Now, Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine supports it, but here's what's puzzling. D.C. has been its own entity longer than Maine. If you see a map of the United States in 1818, Maine was still part of Massachusetts. It didn't become a state until 1820. If you saw a map of the U.S. in 1860, that was 3 years before West Virginia became a state separate from Virginia in 1863. And then in 1887, you had one Dakota territory. 2 years later, you had 2 states, North and South Dakota. Now, here's the point. Here's why I'm bringing this whole thing up. D.C. has been a thing longer than Maine, longer than West Virginia, longer than the Dakotas. Each of those places has their own identity, and so does D.C. The people here are unique. Your family, your beliefs, your politics are unique. D.C. isn't part of Maryland. In fact, Mayor Bowser has said the only solution is statehood. And why do 700,000 people deserve anything less? That's our time for the Q&A tonight. Thanks for joining us here live on Capitol Hill. I'm Adam Longo. I'll see you back at 7 tomorrow.